the last event of our spring programme. We're arranging next semester's programme, which will include, because we know the dates roughly, lectures on the UK and the US elections. Elections which will more than usually reflect world affairs and indeed could be influenced by and indeed possibly even interfered with by some of the subjects of this evening's talk. Our programme began, I can recognise many of you in the room from that January day, with Lord Robertson, the Secretary-General of NATO, the Defence Secretary, former Defence Secretary, who spoke about, as he called it, a very dangerous world. And we meet here at the end of term with our eyes on Rafah and Kharkiv and Tbilisi and Handlover. Yesterday, there was an attempted assassination of the Slovakian Prime Minister, the pro-Russian Slovakian Prime Minister. Mass protests in the capital of Georgia against something a Russian-inspired repressive legislation. Vladimir Putin arrived in Beijing for a state visit, the first foreign visit of his fifth term as president. And President Zelensky postponed all foreign trips as the Russian offensive in the north gained momentum. This is the third Insights event we've had marking the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those events, like this evening's, will be on our past lectures page, so you can watch the lecture in a couple of days' time, and the ones in the past. In November 2022, my colleague Rob Dale, who is here today, gave one of our lectures on Russia's war in Ukraine, how history can counter myths and disinformation. He also organised a symposium for staff and students in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. And then on May the 16th, 2023, we had a panel discussion here, War in Europe, the invasion of Ukraine 1 year on. Quite by chance, a year to the day, we're still here discussing the war now 2 years on. At the symposium, it was quite striking how much so many of us were shocked and surprised at what was taking place. One of the least surprised of commentators is our speaker this evening. He uniquely marries scholarship and impact through his broadcasting, his journalism, and his books. Remarkably prolific writer and commentator. They include A Short History of Russia, How We Understand the World's Most Complex Nation, and next month, his latest book, Downfall, Prigozhin and Putin and the New Fight for the Future of Russia. With 28 other British journalists, including the BBC's Nick Robinson and Clive Myrie, and the editors of The Guardian and the Daily Telegraph, which is a very unusual combination, Telegraph and The Guardian conjoined in this way, the Russian state banned them from entering Russia. On the grounds, the Russian Foreign Ministry said, quote, for the deliberate dissemination of false and one-sided information about Russia and events in Ukraine. In February 2019, our speaker published, We Need to Talk About Putin, How the West Gets Him Wrong. A year later, Russia launched its special military operation. Here to speak on the Russia-Ukraine war, the future of conflict or the past, Mark Galeotti.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I was actually trying to work out. I have been to Newcastle precisely twice in my life. Once when I was 17 on a geography field trip, and once very briefly to a housewarming when I was 21. Now, you may find this hard to believe, but that was a good amount of time ago. But no, I'm delighted to be here, even if it's a rather depressing topic. But then again, you don't get to become a Russianist if you have a problem with depressing topics. So, this notion that I've sort of put out about the future of conflict or the past. On one level, one can easily say, absolutely, it has clearly demonstrated itself to be a conflict of the future. The constant battle between drones and electronic warfare. The degree to which information operations, often seamlessly connected across borders and so forth. This is a very, very 21st century war in some ways. In other ways, though, it is a deeply, depressingly archaic one, as we saw in places like the cities of Bakhmut, for example, which became almost like Stalingrad with Kalashnikovs, or the 19th century geopolitics, which I'll come back to in a moment, which seems to be driving the whole nature of this particular sort of Russian imperial venture. So, look, of course, it is both. It is both new and it is a continuation of trends and developments which have been happening. I don't propose to dwell on the minutiae of the particular value of the NLAWS anti-tank weapon or the TB2 drone, or indeed the tactics used. If people want to really discuss that, we can touch on it in the question and answer bit afterwards. Instead, what I want to do is basically ask 4 sort of fundamental questions about this war, but also what this war tells us about the world and the degree to which we can be pulling the threads of past lessons to help us get some sense of what may lie ahead. So, first of all, what is the nature of the challenge that we get? Is it essentially a Putin problem, or is it a Russia problem? Because a lot rests on that. Obviously, a lot rests in terms of our assessments of precisely what happens and who is to blame, but also our thoughts about future relationships with Russia. Now, my view is that this is first and foremost Putin's war. And particularly, it is informed by his own historical notions. Speaking as a historian, it pains me deeply the degree to which Putin himself seems to think of him as a historian. He has written these lengthy, tedious, and quite frankly, failing grade treatises about his view of Russia, and in particular about Ukraine and the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Tendentious, doing the worst kind of cherry-picking of the bits of history that fit his argument and so forth. But nonetheless, genuine. This is a man who clearly does believe there is a deep historical pedigree to what he's doing at the moment. Whether he blames Lenin for having created Ukraine in the first place, something that I suspect the Ukrainians might have a teeny little qualm about, or more broadly about how to understand the world. Because this is where I want to talk about this sense of 19th century geopolitics. Because I think it's so important to understand, not because to understand all is to forgive all, but nonetheless to understand quite where Putin is coming from and quite why he regards himself as being the defender. And again, it's hard to actually get one's head round. But nonetheless, as far as Putin is concerned, he is on the defense. He is trying to protect and save Russia from a threat. Now, as I said, I really need to stress this point. We do not have to accept his skewed judgment, merely be aware of it. And his view is, look, this reflects how the world really is. And the fact that the West is trying to deny Russia its rightful place as a great power. And this is something one can find in his speeches going back to even before he was president. This notion that for Russia, being a great power is its birthright. It is one with the blood of the Russians, and again, a proper historian would actually say Soviets, including Ukrainians and Belarusians in particular, but the Russians who bled to save civilization from the Nazis, or to save civilization from the early 19th century Antichrist, Napoleon Bonaparte, or, and again this is deeply ahistorical, that Russia somehow soaked up the Mongol invasions, which would otherwise have continued to roll on across the rest of Europe. So there is this fundamental notion that basically, to put it on a blunt level, we owe them. And, as I said, we owe them the status of a great power. Excuse me, I'm on the tail end of a cold. But what does great power mean? It's none of these sort of modern, hippie, soft power, interconnectedness and so forth notions. No. A great power to Putin has a sphere of influence. In other words, countries whose sovereignty is subordinated to the metropolis. He doesn't want to actually necessarily control them. He's not looking to rebuild the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire. But nonetheless, countries like Ukraine should know their place. Know that when it comes down to it, their interests are subordinated to Russia's. Secondly, a great power has a voice, and a voice means a veto, in every single major global issue, whether it directly affects it or not. So in other words, if Russia is not at the table, nothing should get sorted. And thirdly, a great power gets to break the rules. He doesn't want to completely shatter the whole structure of the international order. He just wants Russia to have a get-out-of-jail-free card for whenever it wants it. Now, the thing is, this is very much a 19th century sense of what a powerful nation has. I do tend to think that a Bismarck, a Metternich, or indeed a Castlereagh would actually understand Putin a lot better than many modern politicians. And I say 19th century rather than 18th or 17th or whatever, because the 19th century was also the heyday of colonialism, imperialism. This notion that essentially you can divide the world between those countries the only real question is who owns them, and those countries that own other countries. And Russia is clearly in that latter category. So it's in many ways a very simplistic, but nonetheless, I think, quite pervasive notion. And the trouble is, although I say this, I believe this is to be essentially Putin's war, it's not just Putin's war. It's clear that there is considerable disquiet within Russia about the war. Broadly speaking, I mean, it's very hard to really sort of poll in an authoritarian regime, but nonetheless, a series of surveys give us a sense that, roughly speaking, about a quarter to a third of Russians oppose the war. That doesn't mean to say that they're going out on the streets, because this is also a vicious authoritarianism, in which going out on the streets means you can be arrested and the riot police can truncheon you and drag you off and so forth. But even if it's just quietly, they oppose it. About a similar proportion support the war. That doesn't mean to say that they're enthusiastically behind war crimes or the like. In many cases, it's because they have internalized the propaganda that says, we have no choice. And the middle, they don't really know what to believe. They're trying desperately not to believe anything, because to believe something is dangerous. It's a good, depressing Soviet instinct. If in doubt, just ignore it. If you look at, for example, consumption of news programs on television, it's declined quite strikingly. But on the other hand, if you're looking at things like rom-coms, absolutely doing very well indeed. People want escapism, not reality. But what all this means, and this is where the history bit comes in, is in many ways this is a war that reflects the degree to which Russia has not come to terms with its own history. It's not come to terms with its demons. This is, after all, essentially an empire still. Or, more to the point, it still has imperial assumptions, imperial instincts. Russia has never really had to come to terms with the fact that it's built on the bones of empire. And in part, it's because it's always had an alibi. 1917 Bolshevik rebellion, revolution, meant that essentially it could say, all that bad stuff, that was the Tsar's, mate. Nothing to do with us. We're something totally different. Collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. All that bad stuff, that was those communists. Nothing to do with us. I mean, actually, and in some ways this is desperately sort of casting out, looking for straws, but my hope is that one way or the other, this war, which is going to be either a defeat for Russia or a Pyrrhic victory, but nonetheless represents perhaps, that moment when it's actually forced to come to terms with the fact that the world has moved on. It's Suez Crisis moment. It's Algerian War moment. The point when a former great power is forced to realize that it is no longer what it once was, and it may need to come to terms with that. Now, obviously, as we all know, Britain has come to terms with its past entirely. But the French, I'm not so sure about that. But this is the one point. It's a long-term process. It's a generational process. It hasn't yet really happened in Russia. It may. But the point is that sort of historical overlay is one of the reasons why it's not quite so straightforward. I would love to say it's just Putin. And once Putin goes, everything will be great. I'm still unfashionably optimistic about Russia's longer-term prospects. But nonetheless, we can't pretend that it is purely that one man has dragged a country kicking and screaming into this conflict. Second question is worth asking. Okay, how has Ukraine demonstrated how the nature of war has changed? Yeah, we can look at all the sort of the use of drones and the like. But in the big picture, one of the there's two key developments. As discussed in my book, The Weaponisation of Everything, which happens to be available in the foyer, war has become phenomenally expensive. I won't quite say too expensive to wage. We always manage to find a little bit of money behind the sofa cushions when we want to have a nice little war. But nonetheless, it has become increasingly expensive, not just because of the price of kit, though the price of kit has increased dramatically. You take all the Spitfires and Hurricanes of the RAF during the Battle of Britain, put together how much they all cost, and then index link that to basically convert it into today's money. For all of those planes, you can buy 6 of the shiny new F-22 fighters that we are now buying. 6. And be honest, 6 means maybe you have 2 that are operational at any one time. Now, the F-22 is, when it works, an amazingly competent plane, but still, 6. So, war has become expensive because of the kit, but also because of the world we're in. We're all interconnected. The countries with whom we'll be fighting will quite likely be the countries that are our producers, our suppliers, our customers. Even while this war is going on, Russian gas passing through pipelines on Ukrainian soil. So we are, in many ways, in an age in which conflict is shifted into other realms. Economic warfare, I mean, what we call sanctions, if we're honest, is economic warfare. Lawfare, the use of international law as an instrument. Political war, cultural war. There are so many different ways in which we now try to impose our will that don't involve shooting at people. But we still do end up shooting at people. And here's one of the ironies about the Ukraine war. Right up to the point where Putin invaded, he was winning. What had he been doing for the year before? He had been building up huge forces around Ukraine's borders, more than 100,000 troops, without really making it clear what his objectives were. Under the shadow of Russian guns, investors were flocking out of Ukraine. The Ukrainian economy was increasingly in crisis. And because we in the West were terrified that a war would break out, there was a whole stream of VIPs heading to Moscow, putting Putin in exactly that position of centrality that he likes to be in. The supplicants are coming to him. It's worth noting, he's currently, for the second time in 6 months, going to Beijing. But anyway, no, the supplicants at that point were coming to him to more or less cajole, request, encourage, beg for him not to invade. So the Ukrainian economy was tanking, and the West was increasingly keen to avoid war, and that led to some countries even actually beginning to try and put pressure on the Ukrainian government to make concessions. If Putin had genuinely been this grand master of geopolitical chess that we're sometimes told, he would have let that continue. If only he'd read my book. But whatever, I mean, I think because he was impatient, because he doesn't really understand the world that well, Putin's not that bright. I mean, he has certain skills, but I really don't think he's that bright. And also simply because he thought that Ukraine was there for the picking. This is a man who unfortunately believes his own distorted pseudo-histories, who believes that Ukraine is not a real country, that the Ukrainians are not a real people, and that, therefore, they wouldn't really resist. He invaded. And whether or not one can say that he started losing the minute he crossed the border, though, of course, the first weeks of the war were catastrophically bad for Russia. But nonetheless, it is clear that even if he manages to extract something that looks like a victory, out of this. The costs to Russia will be massive. So, is this new or old? The world has always seen the use of non-kinetic means to support kinetic war. In other words, it's only in a video game that you win a war by killing all the enemy's soldiers. In real war, you win by undermining, destroying the other side's will and capacity to continue fighting. And to that end, we've always used propaganda and subversion and economic pressure in support of our military actions. But what we have seen in Ukraine is precisely, that was because I was like tickling my throat rather than a dramatic pause, precisely actually the degree to which the interconnectivity of the modern world has transformed what was an old way of fighting. I think this is going to be one of the key themes that I'll push out, is actually what we in many ways are seeing as a very old-fashioned war, but one that is fought in different ways because the world has become very different. And that's not, as I say, that's not about drones and such like, that is about the interconnectivity of us all. The degree to which actually Russia is enmeshed in a global economy, which means both a vulnerability, it can be sanctioned and oligarchs can have their yachts sequestered and so forth, but also a strength. When, for example, the Americans incautiously tried to slap sanctions on Rusal, a major Russian aluminium producer, they had to step back very quickly because they suddenly realized that they were destabilizing the entire global aluminium economy, and they need it for their planes and everything else. So we're all connected, and that gives us more scope for basically messing with each other. So the third question is what actually this war is telling us about power in the modern world because of this degree of interconnectivity. We used to have nice, straightforward metrics for power, which we thought, I understood. GDP, population, number of tanks, whatever. The top trumps approach to geopolitics. What this war has really demonstrated is precisely the different types of power, the different variations, which again have always been around, but which have really come to the fore. Morale, obviously, is the classic one, the will to fight. I think that everyone was astonished, well, I say everyone, but was astonished by the degree to which the Ukrainians demonstrated this phenomenal determination to fight, whether as a nation or whether we look at specific engagements like the battle for Mariupol and the like. And in some ways, well, that shouldn't have surprised us because frankly the Ukrainians for 8 years have been expecting something like this and preparing for something like this and in many ways wargaming for something like this. But what else? The power of innovation has also become incredibly evident, and that can be technical. Again, if one looks at, for example, with Ukraine, they demonstrated themselves to be very sort of flexible. So you have the situation of people in their kitchens and on their dining tables assembling drones to then be used at the front. Whole weird and wonderful ecosystem of homemade systems, which have also then, people have come up with all kinds of weird and wonderful ways to incorporate those into warfighting that owe nothing to how general staffs and military academicians thought war would be fought, but it's individual units and individual, what one could almost call military entrepreneurs in this respect, come up with. And that has proven to be, at the moment, pretty much unquantifiable, but equally undeniable strength of the Ukrainians. Not just in terms of technologies, but in terms of the tactics and how they use it. And I remember talking to a British Army officer who had been involved in liaison work with the Ukrainians, and this was last year, who was saying that, as far as he was concerned, this adds 10 to 15% onto their military capability. Now, okay, that was an off the top of the head assessment, and it was after a couple of beers. So we don't want to regard this as a sort of mathematically precise sense. But nonetheless, here you have a professional soldier who is essentially saying that actually even just simply the Ukrainians' innovative capacity represents a substantial increment to their military power. And again, to link it in with history, again, there's always been innovation from the sort of Trojan horse onwards. But the point is, again, in the modern world, it's that much quicker. The cycle from bright idea to actually bright idea being evident on the battlefield. And the capacity then to communicate that bright idea to 10, 50, 100, 1,000 other people who can then take it up and also start, whether it's assembling drones in their kitchen or whatever, is so much faster. The world moves at a fast pace. And innovation is one of these things that actually tends to be at the leading edge. What else? Soft power. Now, soft power, the power of example, the power, to put it bluntly, it's, countries making friends with other countries. That tends to be regarded precisely as, just think of the term, soft. But nonetheless, we have seen it actually have a dramatic impact. Think of the importance of Volodymyr Zelensky himself. Not just as a political leader at home, but as an advocate abroad. Appealing, inspiring, encouraging, sometimes browbeating and cajoling foreign leaders. A man who almost takes pleasure in breaking the diplomatic rules. Willing to actually sort of point out who he thinks is backsliding, who is not actually supporting properly. Now, let's be perfectly honest. There is a risk that this can begin to become old. But on the other hand, the continued stream of Western visitors desperate for a photo opportunity with the man in the khaki T-shirt demonstrates actually that it's still a strong factor. Now again, soft power, the importance of individual leaders, that's always been a factor, hasn't it? Yes, but. The but in question is modern media and democratic politics. The fact is that Zelensky, who is, let's be honest, an entertainer who became a politician, many politicians are merely, shall we say, inadvertent entertainers, understands this. He also understands the importance and the need and the capacity to be able to actually reach out to populations, to use the medium of TV and stardom and podcasts and whatever else, precisely to, if necessary, bypass politicians to bring pressure to bear on them from below. I think this is one of the really sort of striking ways in which actually leaders who traditionally would basically speak unto other leader now can be bypassed by politicians who are basically branding. Ukraine has built a phenomenal brand. Who, before 2022, would imagine that Britain's high streets would be festooned with Ukrainian flags? Even if it's just a token thing that people don't really think about. But nonetheless, the fact that they are there matters, it signifies. And this helps explain why actually the Western alliance, the support for Ukraine, has been so unexpectedly unified and, I think I can use the word generous. Some people say, no, the Ukrainian fight is ours. Let's be honest, one can question that. We could have just sat back. We didn't, though. And I think that's worth noting as something that, frankly, no one really had predicted. And to a large extent, it's precisely because politicians who, frankly, would have probably had all kinds of other things they would like to spend their money on. Billions of pounds, dollars, and euros goes to Ukraine every month. How many politicians, especially politicians facing elections, do not think, actually, a tax cut here, a bit of social spending there, they might want, but there is that sense at the moment that no one dares break ranks. So that kind of power has changed. But there's a flip side to that. And I've been playing with it. I'm calling it dark power at the moment. But what one could think of as an opposite of soft power, as hard power has been taken. is that actually the power of basically being perceived as a supervillain. I mean, this has always been one of Putin's strengths. He is invested with so much power, so much capacity, that people will, because he's a handy alibi, it was Putin that gave us Trump, it was Putin that gave us Brexit or whatever. I mean, actually, none of this is unfortunately true, delighted though I might be to be able to blame Putin for some of these things. But this idea that Putin is precisely this Machiavellian figure, essentially a sort of James Bond villain who really presumably runs Russia from an extinct volcano base somewhere. The only thing is that he's into quite big dogs. He's had a big Labrador called Coney, for example, whatever, and it's not quite the same as having a little white cat on your lap that you can stroke. I have visions of Putin sort of half submerged in large dog. But the point is, also, actually, Putin's capacity to mobilize threat. And again, this, like the soft power, this often works not at the level of states and leaderships, but nations. Particularly before 22, but even to a degree after, especially in Central Europe. There was a degree to which certain populations, certain fractions of populations, would really think, look, we really can't mess with Putin. He's mad. He would do anything. Actually, no, he's basically, you need to pay him off. He's the thuggish protection racketeer rather than anything else. And again, it's actually because of a carefully confected, deliberately confected in many ways, image, which is a product of the modern media environment. So, is this all new? Well, I said it's old, but transformed. And with it, there's an element of, now that different types of power matter all the more, there is in some ways a kind of democratization of power, different niches. So the last question I'd ask is, okay, what does this war also tell us just simply about the changing world? And I think particularly this point about the multiplicity of power. On one level, after all, how could Russia possibly hope to win? Sure, Ukraine is a smaller country. But nonetheless, Ukraine is backed by an alliance with a GDP something like 20 times Russia's combined. What we've discovered is clearly that Russia is not only able, like most authoritarian regimes, to focus its resources that much more effectively. Putin doesn't care if ordinary Russians live a harder life. So long as they don't rebel, if they have a slowly deteriorating quality of life or whatever, he's fine. He's not going to be suffering, trust me. But it's not just about Russia's capacity to focus resources. It's also about, well, as we've discovered, that there are countries that are willing to work with Russia. Obviously, China. As I said, Putin is there at the moment. The Chinese statement when Putin arrived said that they were all going to work together for justice in the world. Not quite how I would actually regard Sino-Russian policy at the moment. But nonetheless, okay, so the Chinese are not willing to sell weapons to the Russians, but all sorts of dual-use technologies, everything from trucks to electrical components. Absolutely. So many other countries, I mean, if you look at the breach of sanctions, the apparent appetite, for example, in Central Asia, all of a sudden, for precisely the kind of microelectronic components that the Russian defense economy desperately needs, is really quite surprising. Anyone would think that they are then being sold on to the Russians. Of course they are. United Arab Emirates, Turkey. There's all sorts of different countries which are actually perfectly willing to basically play both sides. And different countries have become unexpectedly powerful politically, even within the West. I mean, if one looks at policy towards Ukraine, I mean, clearly countries like the Baltic states and Poland have actually acquired a disproportionately loud voice because of the fact that they are sort of so forward in engaging themselves in these policies. Meanwhile, the Russians are cultivating what they have started to talk of as the world majority. We don't really have a good term for it. We tend to call it the global south because we don't want to say things like those poorer countries or whatever. But anyway, whatever it is, the Russians have been cultivating very assiduously and with considerable results. Whether we're talking about United Nations votes, whether we're talking about a continued willingness to buy Russian energy, hire Russian mercenaries or whatever. Is that because they're on the Russian side? No, not really. This is an entirely pragmatic transactional relationship. Yes, the Russians have been surprisingly effective in pushing their own narratives that they're fighting an anti-colonial war against the evil hegemonic West and such like, which some people have been willing to listen to, however obscene a reversal of the reality it may be. But essentially it's because a lot of countries, either they don't see this as their war, or they resent Western attempts to tell them what to do. Remember talking to an West African diplomat a few years back, talking about the fact that the Americans in particular will hit you with what are called secondary sanctions if you engage in various activities and various trade and so forth with Russia that they think should be off limits. And this guy described that as financial imperialism. And I honestly couldn't disagree with him. It may well be that it's the right thing to do, but we also have to acknowledge that basically that's the West trying to tell other parts of the world how they should think and act and be. And, well, they now have options. You know, China is the obvious classic alternative pole of the world, but there are all sorts of other regional alliances, or just simply just do your own thing and we'll just basically challenge the West to do its worst. We even have the rising importance of sub-national or non-national players. The Houthis of Yemen, closing their straits to cargo shipping until it forces the West to go and send naval forces to reopen it. Hamas in Palestine, essentially becoming the focus of the world's attention because of their activities. In other words, and you might think, well, what has all this got to do with Ukraine? It's because Ukraine has to compete for oxygen in a busy, crowded, rapid political environment. That actually means that it matters if all of a sudden we are looking at the Middle East or whatever the next crisis that unfolds may be. There is no more gatekeeper who basically decides what is the issue of the day and what the right answer may be. The days of unipolarity are over, and therefore Ukraine has to very assiduously fight its own corner. And increasingly it is. In the last year, for example, it's been playing a lot more of an active role within Africa, trying to go out and present its case, and try and present the case as to why it actually matters to them. Why, in fact, anything that undermines the global order, that allows might to make right, is also a bad thing for them. We should have been doing it too, but frankly, we were way, way too slow off the mark on that one. So, to kind of wrap up what may seem otherwise a rather disjointed and kind of broad assessment, if people coming here wanting my sort of detailed suggestions as to quite what's going on near Kharkiv or whatever, I could only apologize to you. The problem is that this is the answer. The future conflict or the past? Well, actually, I would say that if you strip away all the new gizmos and technologies, in many ways, I think that what Ukraine shows is that the world is moving back to an older stage. That I think we will discover in due course that the Cold War era, where essentially politics was all dominated and shaped by collision between two and then maybe 2.5 political blocs, but even the whole post-Westphalian order, in which the nation-state was the basic unit of the world order, all of that is actually beginning to fall apart. And when I look at the modern world, I can't help but see, in all the worst and alas not the best senses, the Italian Renaissance. So let me close by explaining that point and linking it to Ukraine. I mean, much as I'd love to see new Michelangelos and Leonardo da Vinci's, it's more that, in fact, the Italian Renaissance was a period of great political dynamism, but one in which actually numerous city-states, some large, some small, some powerful, some much less so, were in a constant shifting constellations of political alliances, sometimes dynastic, sometimes based around certain sort of broad factions and such like. And their wars were more often than not fought not with crossbows and pikes, but precisely through culture, through economic pressure, through subversion, through intelligence activity and covert operations. All these things that we sort of may think are very modern actually are as old as states. And I think that's what the Ukraine war is demonstrating. We focus on the ghastly carnage of the front lines in Ukraine without realizing that that is just one war. There are two wars going on. There is a kinetic shooting war in Ukraine, and then there is this wider non-kinetic war between the West and Russia. And they are largely in sync, but not entirely. But the point is they are different wars. And in some ways, the shooting war is the aberration. The shooting war is the one that actually bucks the trend. The other war is much more common in the 21st century. We are in an age in which actually we do have so many different ways to mess with our neighbors, our rivals, and even our notional friends. So, Putin, as I said, blames Lenin for the existence of Ukraine. Well, fair enough. In some ways, I could just as easily blame Lenin for the whole nature of the war. Lenin, strange kind of hybrid of genuine idealist and the most ruthless pragmatist, brutal pragmatist that one could possibly imagine. But nonetheless, if one looks at the style of warfare that he embraced, it's actually quite interesting that he had no problem unleashing the Red Army when necessary. And I'm not just talking about the Civil War, but whether we're talking about the invasion of Poland and the like. But by preference, he would fight his wars in other ways. He would precisely fight his war through subversion and so forth. And that was at a time when actually the opportunities for Russia to do so were infinitely less. What we now see with Ukraine is that a conflict in one country, a conflict being fought, has now become genuinely global. This is, in some ways, a world war. Again, thank God, it's not a shooting war. But nonetheless, the struggle for sanctions busting and sanctions enforcement is global. The information war is global. The operations of, for example, Russian and possibly even Western intelligence activity is global. I mean, it's interesting that, for example, it's now quite well known that if you want a passport to be able to get yourself into the European Union, one of the best ways or best places to get a dodgy passport that is indeed still a genuine one is Brazil. Everything connects to everything else, which is another one of Lenin's aphorisms. So, conclusion of the conclusion. The Russian-Ukrainian war. Is it of the past? Is it of the future? Well, I want my cake and eat it. It is very much a war that is familiar in the past, but turbocharged by the realities of the present. And there I'll stop. Thank you very much indeed.